Welcome to the Atheist and Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, guys, and welcome to episode 35 of the Atheists and Recovery podcast. And today we are talking about smart recovery. You may have heard of it. It's not very well known. It's very sort of a tiny mutual help group. I'm just kidding. It's huge. And I recommend it often to the people that come to see me. And so today we talked to one of the co-founders of Smart Recovery, Tom Horvath. And we get into the differences between Smart Recovery and how it's different than AA. But also we talk about AA in conjunction with Smart and this concept of dual citizenship. And then Tom gives us some great takeaways at the very end. And one of those takeaways is all about perseverance. And I loved how he highlighted that as one of the tools that you most definitely need in recovery. And so I hope you enjoy today's show. On to our guest, Tom Horvath. Tom has specialized in addiction treatment since 1985. He founded, owns, and operates Practical Recovery Psychology Group in San Diego. He is the past president of the American Psychological Association's Society of Addiction Psychology, Division 50, the world's largest organization of addiction psychologists, and past president of the San Diego Psychological Association, and author of Sex, Drugs, Gambling, and Chocolate, a workbook for overcoming addictions, which was recognized as the self-help book of merit by the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and in Self-Help That Works. He was one of the founders of Smart Recovery, an international nonprofit offering free, self-empowering, science-based mutual support groups for addressing any substance or activity problem. Tom was the volunteer president of Smart for 20 years and continues to serve on its board. He is the fellow of the San Diego Psychological Association, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and the American Psychological Association. Tom has taught graduate addiction courses at Eliot International University and the University of San Diego. Over the years, he has written many blog posts at practicalrecovery.com. Tom presents nationally and internationally about addiction treatment and recovery. Okay, guys, here we go. Tom Horvath, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I thought we would start this conversation, like I do most conversations, by inquiring about your spiritual background from childhood.
I was raised a Catholic. I attended Catholic schools through 6th grade. I gradually drifted away from the church. It's now many decades later, and I have no religious or spiritual affiliation. I like to think about ultimate matters and ultimate beliefs in life, but they tend not to be, or they are not, of a religious nature. So yes, in a nutshell, that's my background.
So let's talk a little bit now about the reason that you're here, a Smart Recovery. Yeah, maybe you could define it and then maybe talk a little bit about how it's different from AA.
Sure. Briefly, Smart Recovery is a community of individuals who are focused on learning about and practicing a self-empowering approach to stopping problematic addictive behaviors. Now, embedded in that sentence is a lot of material that maybe we'll unpack a lot of today, but by comparison to 12-step groups, Smart Recovery is focused on finding a solution within yourself rather than outside of yourself. So we, in a meeting, would focus on what are my thoughts, beliefs, behaviors, and emotions, and how might I change them in order to stop my problematic addictive behaviors. Now, when I say stop, I want to clarify right away that the participant gets to choose which behaviors are problematic and what the problematic part is. So to take a clear example, I could decide that I have a problem with alcohol, but not with pot or nicotine or food. And I just want to focus on alcohol, and that might be by stopping before the first drink, stopping after the second drink, stopping after the 10th drink. It would be up to me to decide that. In SMART, it's understood that the stopping part is the same for everybody. And this is apparently a new idea in addiction recovery, that people who are in those three instances, 0, 2, and 10, we could say they're abstaining, moderating, or engaging in harm reduction, that they all might have something in common, which is stopping. And in SMART, we have a loose set of tools that people can learn, and they discuss them in the meetings and hopefully are successful.
Yeah, I like that, because not everybody is ready at that moment of time just to stop. I mean, I know that in my own experience. I have a private practice in Richmond, Virginia, and coming to me is a huge step, and then another step is just to show up to a meeting, right? That's another huge step. So
yes, it's hard to tell for people which one of those is scarier, to go see the individual therapist or go to a meeting full of strangers.
That's good.
You don't seem scary to me, but I think it would be a big step for a lot of people. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Continue.
Okay, well, that's the main difference. It's the self-empowering versus powerlessness approach. Another difference is that SMART recovery draws its ideas from what has been shown in scientific studies to be helpful for people who are stopping a problematic addictive behavior. So we have this scientific foundation, not a spiritual one. Now, in fact, probably most participants in a SMART recovery meeting also have what they would call a spiritual orientation. But certainly we are a haven for atheists and agnostics, because these issues are simply not to be discussed in a SMART meeting. There are several things we don't discuss. We don't discuss whether addiction is a disease, whether there's a higher power. We don't give people advice. We stay on topic, so we're not going to, except maybe very briefly, talk about baseball or basketball or anything else. We stay focused on that main issue, and certainly relevant to this podcast. We're not discussing spiritual ideas. People are free during check-in or check-out to say what might be meaningful to them or on their minds, but these are not topics of discussion. So the meetings, one last point, the meetings are also quite different because they are true conversations where people interact with one another. They don't have to interact back and forth through the leader, and they are free to engage in what a 12-step meeting would call crosstalk. They actually talk with one another. And for a lot of people, that's very appealing. It makes the meetings a little more challenging to lead, which leads to SMART's biggest challenge probably, which is we're always looking for volunteers to lead meetings. It's our bottleneck. If we had more volunteers, we'd have more meetings, and then atheists and agnostics around the country would have meetings to go to every place, but we're not there yet.
I like that goal. So the main differences, I'm just going to recap here, are that the powerful piece versus the powerless piece. So having that internal locus of control maybe versus the external locus of control.
That's another way to say it. And there's actually some scientific data to show that people in SMART recovery endorse a higher internal locus of control than they do in 12-step.
Okay. I wonder if we should unpack that a bit. So how would I know if SMART recovery is for me based on just that personality characteristic right there?
Well, if we're just looking at that, internal locus or external locus of control is a description of one's orientation towards the future. So if I tend to think that my future will primarily be about what happens to me, what good or bad luck I have, what changes occur in the world, that's an external locus of control. An internal locus of control is about what I'm going to do, regardless of what happens on the outside. Now, in fact, we do shape our worlds and our worlds shape us. So it's a mutual reciprocal process. But the mindset of I'm going to make this happen, or let's see what happens to me, is what that internal versus external locus of control is trying to capture. And internal locus of control is just another way to say self-empowering.
Right. And so if I feel that this is my orientation, I have control over my addiction, I'm the one that can pull myself out of this, then SMART sounds like a good option.
Yes. Now, having said that, there's a couple of qualifiers that are important. Unlike 12-step meetings, SMART recovery meetings, and many of the other newer mutual help groups are much more dependent upon the style of the meeting leader. So you might love smart recovery as an approach. You might not be as enthusiastic about a particular meeting leader. Hopefully in your community, you have more than one meeting to choose from, but that is a significant issue. Of course, one way around that is to just start your own meeting, and we are quite supportive of people doing that, even rather early in their own recovery process, because leading a meeting can be a great support to recovery. It's not the case that you're there to teach others about SMART or to demonstrate your own success. You're there to manage a meeting, and a well-managed meeting proves to be a great opportunity for people to connect, feel not judged, feel supported in the efforts that they're making. And it's a different experience to lead a meeting and participate in a meeting. But if you're starting a first meeting in your town, what you can do is have you lead it some of the time and eventually recruit others to lead it and trade off, or get a second meeting going so that there's one you can also attend. And we have online meetings. So there's, for those with an internal locus of control who are going to make this happen, there are lots of options that we support.
Yeah, no, I like that. There are a lot of options. Yeah. And I always forget to mention the online piece. That's huge, especially in areas that don't have very many smart recovery meetings.
Yes, we have online meetings, about 30 a week. We have a message board that's running all the time. And we will shortly, we've had some IT challenges. We will shortly reinstitute the chat, which is 24/7, which is a great feature in Smart Recovery also.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So a few other differences that I want to highlight that you've already mentioned for the listeners is that the stopping part is not the same for everyone. And you decide what your goals are going to be during your time with SMART. Is that correct?
Yes. So let me say it this way. I'll come at the whole organization from a different way. When we got started in 1994, so we're now 25 years old, and there was a predecessor organization, Rational Recovery, which did establish some foundations for smart recovery. But when the nonprofit split off from the for-profit, that's what happened. The nonprofit, first of all, said, we have a 4-point program. Those points are, you're going to build and maintain motivation to change. 2, you're going to learn how to cope with cravings or urges or desires, call them what you wish. 3, you're going to learn how to manage your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in a new and better way. You could call that problem solving. And 4th, you're going to lead a life with better lifestyle balance so that you're less likely to fall back into these problems. So motivation, coping, problem solving, lifestyle balance, that's the 4-point program. A few years later, that happened within the first year or two. The 4-point program is established. A year or two later, we established a slogan, discover the power of choice. And this is a very popular idea in SMART, and it's our foundation for saying these are all your decisions. Somewhat more recently, then, we said what our actual purpose is. We clarified it's to help individuals stop problematic addictive behaviors as you understand them. And that we now have a clear sense of what the purpose of the meeting is. That was always known, but maybe not as clearly stated as we've done it in the last year. And lastly, we have been now completely open to a full range of tools. We had an original tool set that is still quite valuable and useful, but it hadn't been updated sufficiently. So now we're in the process of adding tools, and they get vetted actually by their use in the community. There are a lot of tools that are quite helpful to people, but they should be done effectively between a therapist and a client. Some tools work out very well for meetings, and those that survive this evolutionary vetting process in SMART we'll keep promoting on our website, and people will learn how to use them. So a 4-point program, a slogan, the focus on stopping problematic addictive behaviors, and a continually updated set of tools. We have a fully founded and established approach that won't work for everybody, because nothing works for everybody, but can be quite helpful to anybody who's willing to put some time and effort into pursuing it.
Yeah, I agree. And I love the community piece to the alternatives to 12-step and even AA. I mean, if, when you can't find a smart recovery meeting, and hopefully those will be increasing as time moves on and we find more volunteers, people will do smart recovery and AA and are quite happy with that,
Well, you're pointing to an interesting finding that I finally realized a few years ago, and I labeled these individuals dual citizens. And it turns out that despite this emphasis on internal and external locus of control, self-empowerment versus powerlessness, it may be that these groups, 12-step groups and SMART and other self-empowering groups, work by a similar method. And I think this drives some people nuts because in 12 steps, they say, it's the 12 step, it's your higher power, etc. And in SMART, people are saying, it's the tools, it's the tools, it's the tools. And the data so far suggests that it's coming together and creating a new social network, joining a new community that partly supports you when you talk and partly gives you people to hang out with and things to do, that's actually the underlying mechanism of action in both groups. And if that's true, it would make sense of how people who are atheists, for instance, who go to 12-step and don't buy into a higher power of the 12 steps at all,
right,
but still find their experience there helpful to them. They have to manage it carefully. But I've heard from many atheists over the years that they figure out how to make that work. So it's not what AA says is working, it's something else, and that appears to be social network. So from that perspective, we should probably be accepting of whatever choices people make about mutual help groups and not be surprised by them, because all of them could be effective.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I couldn't agree more. I believe, and I say this on the podcast often, that, we recover in community. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that.
Sure. I think it's been a challenge in both organizations to help people understand that what draws people in the door, in the case of SMART, it's tools and a rational approach, may not be actually the curative elements. But again, there's probably different curative elements for different people, but community, social network is probably the primary one for most people.
Mm-hmm. Right. And what recovery looks like at the beginning, maybe needing that higher power or that spiritual connection, may not be what you end up with at the end, right? Moving more towards tools and figuring out your own source of hope in recovery. So, yeah. Okay. Well, as we start to wrap up a bit here, been on your website and I found a quote on there that I don't know if you wrote, but you must believe in because it's on your website. So I thought maybe I would share that with the audience and you could tell me what you think about it. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time.
Yes, this is... Oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the author right now. It's not Auden. I have to look it up in a moment. But this is some poetry that I thought was a good description of the process of psychotherapy, that we go exploring and we end up becoming clearer about who we are. And some of that's just appreciating our constitutions and temperaments. I know I'm in my 60s now, and my father is deceased, and in many ways, through much of my life, or certainly the first third of it, I was very busy defining myself as quite different from him. And in more recent decades, it just keeps tickling me to realize how much I am the same, even though there are some differences, certainly, but by constitution and temperament, I have a lot in common with him. And that process of rediscovering myself, partly by thinking about my relationship with him and with others, that's just one aspect of it. Another part is certainly learning about my own beliefs, what I think about myself and the world and the future, and how those have evolved over the years. I imagine that for some people, psychotherapy is the primary way they do that, but there are other ways to do it. Certainly just reading good books, having good conversations with friends, being reflective, engaging in any sort of, let's call them self-improvement exercises or activities, can lead people on that process of self-discovery. It's Socrates who suggests in Plato's dialogues that we need to keep examining our lives. And I think of it a bit like meditation. Many people have tried meditation and they discover how fiendishly difficult it is. But the point of meditating is actually you're just trying to meditate. As long as you're trying to meditate, you're meditating, because we don't often get to So meditators tell me they don't often get to a place of being able to say, oh, I was just completely contemplating my breathing for the last hour and I didn't have one other extraneous thought. I don't think I've ever heard that. So it's the process of trying to discover ourselves that I think is a very important process in life. And often in addiction recovery, we need to get to what our deepest beliefs, values, and roots are, because that will help us stop the problematic addictive behaviors and move on with a more valued life.
Mm-hmm. To be curious, to stay curious.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a pretty good place to end. But before we do you have any other final thoughts for us and for the listeners?
Well, so I am a psychologist in private practice, and our facility is called Practical Recovery. We're an outpatient program. Our website is practicalrecovery.com. And when I think about the big picture of these changes that people make, they do need to understand that there are multiple pathways to recovery, and no pathway works for everybody. Every pathway probably works for somebody. And one of your biggest jobs is to keep persevering until you find the pathway that seems to work for you. So that's one key point. And additionally, I would say that more important than focusing on stopping is actually developing a more valued life. So most of my effort when I'm working with a client is on how to build up the new life, so that when I contemplate going out and getting drunk on Friday night, I'm also thinking about what I've got planned for Saturday morning that's actually very important to me. And therefore, I don't want to get drunk on Friday night because I don't want to be hungover for or miss this Saturday activity that will ultimately pull people through that new life. And like most projects in life, persistence is one of the great virtues. So even if you, in meditating, you just keep working on it, and eventually you will get better. Most people do resolve their problematic addictive behaviors. You don't hear that from the industry very much. I guess it's perceived as bad for business, but in fact, most of us make great progress or completely resolve these problems. And I think people should keep that in mind, that that's the good likely outcome.
I love that. Tom, how can people best find you and some of the work that you've put out into the world?
Well, the first place would be our website, practicalrecovery.com. If you want to learn about smart recovery, you would go to smartrecovery.org. And from there are links to all kinds of other places. The website that we have in San Diego, which I'm quite proud of because we have 50 or 60 meetings here in our county now, is Smart Recovery SD for San Diego, smartrecoverysd.org. So those would be the places, and either off of practicalrecovery.com or smartrecoverysd.org, emails sent from those websites will get to me.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much for being on.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed the discussion.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists and Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.